How could God allow me to go through 8 months and counting of intense anxiety, depression, doubt? Is he there in the first place? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher's Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. This is the video that I never wanted to write. It was about 8 months ago. I had spent the last 6 or 7 videos in this playlist talking about answers to the logical problem of evil and to the evidential problem of evil. And I thought I'd done a pretty good job. And I was writing a video on what I call the existential problem of evil. And that's sort of putting aside all the theory and everything. And when suffering happens to me, when something really bad happens to me, I asked that question, how could God let this happen to me? Is he really there in the first place? Which was ironic because that was about the time when I had a massive panic attack. And for the last 8 months, I've been fighting off intense anxiety and depression, and I've had a lot of doubt. If you've never experienced something like this, I know that sounds like it's not that big of a deal, right? So anxiety, you get scared sometimes? And depression, you get sad about things. Okay, is that so bad? But if you've gone through it, you know that, this is like hell. It was really one of the worst sufferings I could imagine. I think it was particularly acute for me. I was hospitalized at one point for suicidal ideation, and that wasn't fun. That was pretty awful, in fact. But the fact is, I had done nothing wrong. I didn't deserve any of this. And I found myself incredibly angry at God for allowing this. And several times, I doubted whether he was there in the first place. I found myself asking the very question that I was going to address in this video in the first place, which is, how could God allow this to happen to me? Is he even there? Up until this point, we've had all kinds of theory, and that's been great and all. But when you are in the middle of intense, long-term suffering, all of a sudden things seem totally different, right? All those nice answers that we had already, they were great because we were in the middle of hypothetical situations, and we could always call time out on them, and then we could step away and come back to the real and happy world. But when you're in the middle of those intense long-term suffering, then you can't push pause. You're just, you're stuck, and there's no way out, and you can't see your way out. And it's crazy, right? It is a crazy experience to be in something like that. So let's talk about this question, how could God allow this to happen to me? And I think it really comes down to 2 big questions. And I'll address one of them in this video and one in the next video. The first question I'll call the theoretical atheist question, which is, so does God not exist then? And then the second one is the practical atheist question, which is, assuming that God exists and assuming he allowed this stuff to happen to me, why should I turn to God rather than turn away from God? So let's look at that first question. Does God not exist? I found this question to be incredibly painful. Many times it threw me into anxiety attacks. I thought, am I losing my faith and am I going to hell? What am I going to tell my children? Will I have to give up all my intellectual integrity now just to sort of hold on to this last little bit of faith that I have? Now, there are 3 ways that I found that this question manifested itself in my life and through my suffering. And the first of which I'll call the existential problem of evil. So this looks something like the following. If God existed, he wouldn't allow the evil thing happening to me to exist, but the evil thing happening to me does exist, therefore God does not exist. And in the middle of my suffering, there were some times when the depression was so shocking. I felt this, I felt this sort of like, how is it possible that God would allow this? Does it even make sense that God could allow something that's this bad? It's not, I don't know. It's hard for me to explain to people who haven't actually gone through depression what it's like. But if you've ever had, that sinking feeling, when something is, oh gosh, something really went bad. It's that sort of moment of despair that you have. Yeah, take that sinking feeling and continue on down for a long way and stay there for several days and you're literally in the pit of despair. That is a great metaphor there. So I shouldn't have said literally. You're figuratively in the pit of despair. You can't see your way out, right? And you're just stuck in this awful feeling. The entire world is awful, and that doesn't even do it justice, because you can't see like what it's like unless you've actually experienced that. And in these times of me sitting in this pit of despair, just shocked about how evil it was, I had this problem, the existential problem of evil. How could God allow this evil thing happening to me to exist? Now, what's interesting is the existential problem of evil is actually just an instance of the evidential problem of evil. So we've seen, I've had a video on that before, but the evidential problem of evil is something like this. If God existed, then evil thing X would not exist, but evil thing X does exist, therefore God does not exist. Where you could just substitute in this evil thing happening to me for evil thing X. I also had a video on skeptical theism. And in skeptical theism, I talked about the fact that God has an infinite intellect, explains how we can have some kind of redemptive purpose to any kind of evil that we see in the real world. So God is an infinite intellect, therefore he can conceive of redemptive purposes for evil things that our finite minds could not fathom. So anything you see, right, like God has some kind of reason for, and we just can't think of it. And he's also all powerful, so he's able to bring about those redemptive purposes, and he's also all good, so he will bring about those redemptive purposes. So any evil thing you see, there is some good reason why it's there, even though we might not be able to figure it out in, this side of heaven. Now, I think this is an excellent response to the evidential problem of evil, and therefore also to the existential problem of evil. The problem is, when I was in the middle of a depressive state or an anxiety attack or something like that, all of a sudden that answer just didn't sit well with me anymore. I was in the middle of these attacks, and I knew intellectually that it made sense, but I still was just sort of like, oh, yeah, I don't know. Something was wrong. And I became confused. Did that mean I was no longer convinced of this argument? Does that mean I no longer believe in God anymore? What does this all mean? And I can say confidently now, after long time of soul searching and hours of counseling, that is absolutely not what that means. The truth is, I didn't find that answer unconvincing so much as I found it repellent. I was really angry at God for allowing this, and I didn't want there to be some good reason for his allowing this. I just wanted him to stop it. I just wanted him to take it out of my life. And admitting that there might be some good purpose for him to allow this thing felt like I was giving up the possibility of him just taking it away. So I didn't want to accept that. And the important thing to note about this reaction, that it's not a philosophical reaction. It's not a philosophical problem anymore. It's an emotional problem now. The skeptical theist argument still makes all the sense in the world to me. It wasn't that I am no longer convinced about it. It's that I just didn't want to accept the answer anymore. Trying to solve this problem by throwing more intellectual answers at it is just going to make things worse, because it's not an intellectual problem in the first place. It's an emotional one. So if I'm not going to solve this intellectually, if I'm not going to solve this with my brain, then how is it that I'm going to solve this? How am I going to figure this out in the first place? I don't have all the answers for you, by the way. If you're in the middle of long suffering, man, I feel for you. I know what it's like, and stay strong, man. You can make it through, man or woman. You can make it through. But I got some pro tips for you. Tip number 1 is rely on God. And I know that sounds kind of trite, especially when you're going through it. I know when people say stuff like that, you're just like, dude, shut up. Like, that is just not what I want to hear right now. But to be honest, like, that is absolutely what you need to do. I had to walk with God through the suffering and not walk away from him. And only then could I see that he is faithful to deliver me through the suffering. Every time I went into a depressive state, and I still get them, but not as bad as I was getting them, for sure. Like, I'm getting a lot better, but every time I go through the depressive state, I lean on him or on somebody that he has sent me, and he gets me through it. And now, before, I knew intellectually that you're supposed to rely on God and he gets you through whatever, right? But I had no real firsthand experience. Now that I've gone through it, now I see firsthand, that he is faithful to get you through these things. And I think that's why at the time, the skeptical theist answer was not felicitous. I think it was because I hadn't lived it out. I haven't lived this out. It wasn't until I lived it out that I actually started to buy it. Pro tip number 2, be open and honest with God about your anger, because you're probably going to be really angry just like I was, right? Especially because a lot of times this suffering is not your fault. Sometimes suffering is our fault. Sometimes we did something wrong and we're just experiencing the repercussions of what we did wrong. But a lot of times the suffering that you go through is not your fault, and you will harbor a whole lot of anger because of it. And God wants you to be honest with him. He doesn't want you to fake it. He doesn't want you to fake piety, and that's only going to make things way worse. Trust me. Like if you try to repress your anger at God, then it's going to turn into depression. So you want to tell him that how you're feeling. Be honest with how you're feeling about him, to him. But that doesn't mean you have to curse him out or anything like that. He's still God, but still he wants the honesty. Pro tip number 3, find a safe person or counselor to speak your mind to. I think, God puts these people in our path, and if we don't avail ourselves of these people, we can go to very dark places. A lot of times he tries to reach us through these people. So definitely find people that you can trust that will get you through this. Tip 4, don't seek the why of the suffering, seek the what can I learn from this suffering. I said that God allows all evils for some good purpose, but I didn't say what that good purpose is. A lot of times we won't know what the good purpose is. In the book of Job, for example, Job gets a chance to actually talk to God and bring up all this, why is all this suffering happened to me? And God doesn't actually answer the question. He instead tells him, hey, you're going to have to trust me. I know way more than you do. So sometimes we just won't know the why of the suffering. Usually we won't know it while it's happening. I happen to know, I think, at the very beginning why some of it was happening. I think I figured out right off the bat that God was going to try to, build my character, make me stronger. That was one reason. And I had also sort of grown distant from him. I just sort of kept him at arm's length, just to, I don't know. I just wanted to do my own thing, and I wanted God to do his thing, and I wanted to meet up in heaven sometime. But, I don't know. I was scared of God, really. It's weird to say that, but I was just scared of him. And, I wanted to be, safe, and I knew God wanted me to come into a relationship with him and wanted me to get over that fear and see who he really was. And so those two things right off the bat, I kind of knew, but there were other things that I didn't know right off the bat, that it wasn't until I got through the suffering that I found out. So sometimes once you get past the suffering, that's when you find out what the suffering was all about. So, for example, one of the things that I've learned going through this that I wouldn't have known beforehand is that an experiential knowledge that you can endure intense suffering with God's help. I wasn't totally convinced of that beforehand, and I might have said so, but I don't think I really believed it. And going through this, I see, yeah, actually you can. You can make it through anything with God's help. It's pretty crazy. Yeah, I wouldn't have known that beforehand, and I didn't know that I didn't know that beforehand. That's the weird part. So I found out some of the reason for the suffering afterwards, and there also are some reasons that I probably have no idea about that I won't know until I get to heaven. Till he tells me then, hey, by the way, here's something else you missed. So yeah, don't seek the why necessarily. Seeking out why are you allowing this to happen is really going to lead you to a place of frustration, because sometimes you're seeking what can't be discovered just yet. It might be discovered, a long time down the line, but you're just going to make your suffering way worse by panicking yourself like that. So instead, take every moment of the suffering and ask yourself, or ask God, what do you want me to take from this? What can I learn from this situation? And I know that's not a fun thing to say to you guys, because I know when people were telling me that, I was just like, stop telling me that, I don't want to do that. I'm hurting here. But it really is it is one of the big reasons it's one of the big things that gets you out of that kind of mentality of this suffering is so bad. And the last tip I would say is to be grateful. Find something to be grateful for every time that you're in those situations. And that helps you out a lot. It's become a trite kind of a thing. Everybody says gratitude, #gratitude. But I do think it helps a lot to look at the different blessings that you have as well, and then thank God for those blessings. And I think you have to thank God. I know people nowadays are like just #grateful, and they're not grateful to anyone in particular. And I'm kind of like, grateful to whom? You don't say thank you to nothing. Thank you, luckiness. That doesn't. That's not gratitude. That's just like, fingers crossed. So yeah, I think that you really change your mentality when you're grateful for the things that you're in your life that you have that are good, even through the suffering. And it's hard to do, man. It's hard. Like, it's easy to say, it's hard to do when you're just like in so much pain that you're just looking around and like, thank you for this damn sticker over here that I like. Oh, you know what I mean? Like, that's when I started doing. I remember being just so pissed and looking at stuff and being like, thanks for that. But I mean, yeah, it's hard. It's so hard. A second source of doubt that I had that was even more psychological and even less philosophical is this. Throughout this time of anxiety and depression, I had a lingering sense of doubt at times. Sometimes nothing in particular triggered it, but I just find myself racked with fear that God wasn't there. And what I ended up doing was, just spinning my wheels, trying to prove to myself that God existed in every possible way that I could. And it ended up just driving me more crazy than anything else. Then one day I prayed and asked God, could you please just show me what is the deal? Just help me with this doubt. What is going on? And the very next day I went to see my counselor, and he said he had been praying for me and that God had told him that, to tell me that it's not an intellectual problem. Like I said before, it's not an intellectual problem. It's an emotional problem that I'm having. And that, first of all, released a lot for me, because I was just feeling like, oh my gosh, how can I solve all these issues? There's just so many problems in the world, or like so many different things that pop in my head, and I can't solve them all. That relieved a lot of stress for me when I realized that I don't have to answer all these questions. It's not, those aren't the problem. The problem is not that. And then the very next day, I got to get on a phone call with the great philosopher J.P. Moreland, and he told me the exact same, again, without me even asking him precisely the question. He told me, again, you're having an emotional issue, not an intellectual issue. And I learned from both of them that apparently there's just a pattern of men, mostly, some women too, but mostly men, who have been either emotionally or actually abandoned by their fathers when they were younger. And because of that, they, when you're really little, and because of that, you feel, you've developed this sort of fear of being abandoned by God the Father. Like you live in this constant fear of just the top guy on the pyramid is going to just not be there. And again, that's a psychological issue. That's not a philosophical issue. So all the philosophical proofs in the world are not going to help you. They're not going to work. Instead, if that's you, if you're like me and you have this problem, first of all, I feel for you, man. Like that, this has taken months and months of counseling for me on my part. But you got to learn how to trust God. That's as simple as it is. God says in Hebrews 13:5, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And you got to learn how to trust that. And you have a long road of walking with God and him not leaving you, and you trusting him through it. You're just walking step by step and trusting him that he's going to be there every step of the way. And he keeps proving his faithfulness over and over again. And once you get through, long enough, you start to feel confident and more confident. Okay, he is going to be there. He was there like all those other steps. He's going to be there on the next step. And that's really how you get through this. Now, I know if you're like me, when people told me this, they told me this is what you need to do. And if you're like me, the first thing I thought was, wait a second, but aren't you saying I need to trust God that he exists? So I have to trust him that he has proof that he exists? Isn't that circular? But that's not exactly what's happening. Again, this is a psychological problem, not a philosophical problem. So you're trusting that he's going to be there because psychologically speaking, you're having these doubts, but they're not philosophical doubts. That's the whole point. Although you could also say, possibly you could argue that we have like some kind of basic knowledge of God that's implanted in us, like Romans 1:18 through 21. I think that's the passage that says that we have a natural knowledge of God. And then there's also this knowledge of assent, right? When we say that, yes, and I believe that. And we trust God to get from the natural knowledge that we have to that assenting knowledge. Yes, I believe that kind of knowledge. And that wouldn't be circular if that bothers you. I don't know because it would have bothered me a lot back then. And so I actually thought about these things a lot, like while I was going through these things, like, well, how can I solve these things? So you may just think I'm neurotic. I don't know. So yeah, just a little bit more on how do you learn how to trust God. I was given the tip that you want to bring all of your thoughts and emotions to him and sit with him at those thoughts and emotions. And I think here's my super pro tip. You got to find a counselor or a therapist, and that helps you to walk through this, because you probably have years of pent up anger that you don't know about. And it's true. Like it's there. So you got to find one. And since this is about God, if you're a Christian, I highly recommend a Christian counselor, because only they're going to know about your walk with God. So finally, the third way this manifested in my life was through doubt from the desire for Cartesian certainty, what we'll call Cartesian certainty. So here's the situation. We have sort of three possible positions we could take. One, we should believe in God. Two, we should not believe in God. And three, we should abstain from belief or not belief. Our obligation is to look at all the evidence that there is and to pick which one of those three propositions we should assent to. Now, here's where we stand on this situation. There are some, depending on how you count them, some 39 arguments for the existence of God. And many of them have withstood centuries of debate. And I find them very convincing. On the other hand, there are only really two arguments against the existence of God. One of which is the problem of evil, which we've been talking about, for the past playlist. And for that reason, I don't find that convincing. And the other one is the argument from science, which I think is a really weak argument. And I can do other videos about that argument, but I'm not like dissing science or anything like that. It's just that I think when I lay out that argument, you'll see that it's not really an argument against the existence of God in the first place, and it's really weak in the second place. Yeah, where we stand is, I believe, heavily on the side of we should believe in God. We should believe that God exists. And yet, does that mean that there is no reason to doubt that God exists? Does that mean is it possible that every single one of those 39 proofs is false, is invalid for some reason? Is it possible that all of the responses to the problem of evil are somehow wrong? I don't know. Is it possible we missed something somewhere? I guess so. And that's what really threw me through all this. It just drove me crazy. The fact that there was just like the possibility of doubt. This is even a sliver of doubt. I didn't want that. I wanted total 100% certainty. And if I didn't have that, I didn't know what I was going to do. And this was maybe not as dramatic, but this was the same thing that plagued a philosopher named Rene Descartes in the 1600s. He set out to prove the existence of God with the same certainty that you believe that 2 + 2 = 4. In fact, I would say probably more certainty, because he thought you could even doubt that, but you couldn't. He wanted to show that you couldn't doubt that God exists at all. And in order to do so, he said, all right, let's do this. Let's doubt everything that we could possibly doubt. And then from there, I'll build up an argument to show you that God exists. And unfortunately, once he doubted everything that he could doubt, there was really nowhere else to go. There was very little that you can't doubt, right? I mean, if you think about it, there's so many things we can doubt. Look at the real world. Look around you. Do you know that this isn't a dream right now that you're having? Do you know that this is reality 100%? Look at people around you. Do you know that they have minds? Or how do you know they have minds and they aren't just super sophisticated zombies with no minds? You know, they're acting exactly like human beings would act, but they don't actually have minds. How do you know? How do you know that the entire world is not in a plot against you? And they all act like they're not, but they're just waiting for the right time. How do you know? How do you know that every time you're about to take a bite of something to eat, it hasn't been poisoned while you weren't looking? Even while you're blinking, right? When you're blinking, somebody just squirted a real quick cyanide on there. So I don't know. I don't know what poison looks like or smells like or tastes like. So I guess that's good. So how do you know that? The truth is you can always doubt those things, right? There's doubt in almost any belief that we have. But does that mean you don't know those things? Do you know that the guy next to you has a mind? Yeah, you do. I mean, you can doubt it. Yeah, okay, great. But you know. So we know all these things, even though there's a sliver of doubt that we're wrong. You know, and almost everything that we believe is like that. Demanding Cartesian certainty for any belief almost is just impossible. It's just not there. And that's okay. The real question isn't, is it 100% certain or not? The real question is, should we believe it or not? And when it comes to the case of God, I think the answer is clearly yes. Before I go, let me consider one more aspect of this problem. And it's the hiddenness of God. You know, why doesn't God show up? It's weird because you pray and pray and pray like, God, please bail me out of this. You know, please heal me from this stuff. And he does heal some people. I've heard some wild healing stories, and not just like psychosomatic healing, but like legit healing stories. But sometimes he doesn't heal. And what do you do with that? Like, why doesn't he show up? Why doesn't he like do something? I mean, even just make it easier, or I don't know, something like that. And my counselor, Kevin, told me a very interesting parable. And he said, imagine you have a child that is throwing a tantrum because he wants something. And you take that child and you give it, as the moment that child feels some kind of pain of, you know, of desire, you give that child exactly what it wants. And every time that happens, you keep doing that. You keep giving it exactly what it wants. What's going to happen with that child? Well, that child is going to think that any kind of inconvenience is totally unacceptable, is totally evil, right? Is insurmountable kind of a obstacle. And the child is going to think that all people are only there just to solve its problems. It's going to think that the way to handle problems is to throw tantrums. And it's going to think, and it's going to have its growth stunted. You know, as a human being, as a person, it's not going to be quite as robust of a person because of it. And the same thing goes with us asking for healing. But what if God were to bail me out every time I was experiencing that suffering? Well, again, I would think that suffering was insurmountable. I would think that, oh yeah, he came in there because I couldn't, there's no way I could handle it. But yeah, I could. I just didn't know I could. And that's one thing. Another thing is I would think that everybody around me was, you know, or God is specifically, I would think that God was only there to solve my problems. Every time I have a pain, God bail me out. I would think that the only way to deal with suffering is to throw up my hands and say, God, bail me out of this, right? And finally, I would be stunted as a human, right? I would not grow as a human being. I would be left as this, feeble kind of existence. And I wouldn't want that. So I think there are good reasons that God doesn't bail us out of some suffering. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. And it's hard when he doesn't. It feels like he doesn't care, but that's not the case. It's because he loves us that he doesn't bail us out. Just like because you love your child, you don't exceed every time he throws a tantrum. That's all I have for this video. Again, in the next video, I'm going to talk about the practical atheist question, which is, why should I turn to God rather than turning from God? But please let me know if you have any questions in the comments. And I hope this was helpful to you. I know this was a lot of very personal information. I hope that wasn't too weird. But I just thought, dude, 8 months of suffering for me, this has got to help somebody. I better help somebody with this, because otherwise it's going to be a total waste. So I hope it helps somebody out there. Anyways, that's all I got for today. I'll see you in the next video. Adios.